So, she is not expected to be here then.
If she shows up.
Introductions.
Sure.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to writing intermediate level stuff. Supposed to do a quick bit of introductions. Hi, I'm Fugue. I am an editor at Soapful Press, so I help out a lot behind the scenes. I have a story that just came out in Dissident Signals by Fur Planet, if you want to go pick that up.
Hi, I'm TJ Mind. I am a writer who has been published in Heat 15 this year, as well as Distant Signals, and a number of other anthologies available through the Fur Planet, and there's some help publications.
I'm Sparf. My most recent publications are Arcana, and blanking on everything else because it's apparently that kind of day. I've been in Fang 6, Fang 7, a few other various and sundry publications. So that's me.
Okay. So maybe we should start off with a question more generic before we go to open questions, which is the idea of this is it's supposed to be the intermediate writing panel. What do you do after you have kind of gotten your first stories out there and want to improve your craft, improve your marketing, improve the general qualities of your writing? So I turn that question to both of you.
So personally, I'd say find a writing group. I mean, that's where I would start at that point. Once you've already gotten, you've written your first thing, you've thrown it up online, you've gotten feedback, okay? You have other ideas, keep improving. How do you improve? Get feedback. Feedback's a great way to get that.
I'll second that on feedback. If you're not able to, find a writing group immediately, there exist resources in the fandom, the Furry Writers Guild. Check the forums. There are places for critique. Go in there, read the posts, start getting to know people. If you strike up a good working rapport with someone, then you can do sort of one-on-one beta feedback. They'll read for you. Maybe you could read for them and give critique. Definitely look into feedback is the single most important thing. There is no story that thrives without feedback and critique. And before it comes up, because it always does come up, I'm going to add to that: nobody is going to steal your story if you give it to them for feedback. That's not a thing. If it happened once, it was once. It's not something you have to worry about. If someone is going to do that, you're probably going to be aware of them being a little sketchy from the beginning, and maybe you're not as comfortable around them. It's not something you have to worry about. Get your feedback out there. Yeah.
I think I'd say that a good thing to do once you kind of have gotten past the initial, oh, hey, I've done some stuff as a writer, is to experiment a little. Because one of the big things that a lot of writers talk about is finding your voice, finding your style. What is it you are as a writer, right? Are you a very florid, detail-oriented writer? Are you a very minimalistic writer? Do you prefer a particular genre? Do you like a particular way of do you do the quick, snappy dialogue, or do you do long paragraphs of diatribes? And so I really encourage authors who are kind of hitting the intermediate stage to try different things. Try genres you might not have even thought of, because maybe you'll find out you're surprisingly good at them or you really like it. I might also suggest doing the terrible thing. So I know in particular, those of you who have met Ash, Ash has an MBA in English?
MFA.
No, MFA, what am I saying? In English. So he had to do, of course, a dissertation. And not dissertation, he did a master's thesis. Rude. I can word good on a Friday, I swear I can. So he mentioned as a part of this, one of the things he had to do is he had to read Charles Dickens' Bleak House something like 10 times. How else does one get a master's in English?
Literally any other way you can possibly do it.
And he has mentioned as a consequence of this, that after you go through this whole process and you're just analyzing every little thing, that you can't sit back and properly enjoy, especially that thing that you analyze so carefully, right? You have torn it to pieces, you now understand how everything works, and now you can't just sit back and enjoy it anymore. So it's a terrible thing to do, but I also recommend that you do it with something. Maybe not do it with your favorite story. Like, I'm a massive fan of The Wizard of Earthsea. I don't want to go through and tear that apart and understand how it ticks, because then I won't be able to enjoy it as much. But if you have maybe a good story that you liked but isn't your favorite, a thing to do is to go in and tear it apart and figure out how it worked. Why did you like it so much? You know, just take one paragraph that really stood out to you and figure out, why did that adverb go there? Why was the sentence arranged in this particular way? Why were these two sentences put next to each other instead of these two sentences? Why was the dialogue like that? Why was the accent like that? Do everything. Analyze the heck out of it until you understand how it works. Because then you can go and apply all of that knowledge to your own writing.
So I'll talk about analysis if you're going to do that. I have opinions. Imagine that.
Strong and white's your favorite hand,
I will
right?
kill you and hide your body.
Do not
Strunk
tell him
and white.
he has an ice cream scoop right there.
Strunk and white. People will tell you, oh, get a copy of The Elements of Style. No. Burn it. The Elements of Style is a useless book. It is inaccurate. It's things that it's trying to warn you against. It doesn't understand. It doesn't understand the passive voice to such a degree that at least half of the examples aren't passive voice, and the ones that are constructed to be terrible. You will notice them in your writing. This panel is being very much enjoyed by me. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, does that apply to all manuals of style, like say the Chicago manual of style, or just?
No.
No.
The Elements of Style is a particular case that gets tossed around a lot. Like the style guides are things to be followed for academic writing and things like that. You tend to have to worry about them less as an author of fiction. The publishers will deal with stylizing it.
Yeah.
One recommendation I have heard is a good one. I have not read it myself, even though I had a copy of it and I'm bad. Eat Shoots and Leaves, I've heard, is a good one. I said heard. So
It is. It's an excellent book. There's one caveat to it. Eat Shoots and Leaves is primarily a guide to punctuation. It is also written by a British woman. Lynn Truss is British, and the book, as published in America, was unaltered. So there are certain punctuation things you have to be aware of, so you have to know the differences in British and American rules. Commas in the United States go inside the dialogue quotation mark, not outside it.
Yes, they do. This is something we have to deal with some of our Canadian and British friends. I love them, but they put the commas in the wrong place.
But it's the right place for them. The other, not to try to talk over everybody too much, I'm so sorry. I'm just loud. The other thing that people will tell you in terms of story structure, if you want to analyze it, is Joseph Campbell's The Hero of a Thousand Faces. It's a wonderful analytical tool. It's a fantastic way of looking at mythology and the hero's journey. It is not, however, a blueprint. And also, if you're reading it, he has a passionate love affair with Sigmund Freud, and you should probably just start skimming those sections. But like the core of it is a really useful tool for analyzing a story in terms of what the hero is doing when. You can use that text and follow along and pick apart Star Wars: A New Hope, because the beats are there. It is also useful for telling you how it diverges from that, and if that, you can see if that was a choice that worked or not. And that's where people fall off, because they think it's, oh, I have to follow the hero's journey. And I'll tell you, the thing about the hero's journey that makes me incredibly angry is the end of it, which is the hero must return home. I'm sorry, I have seen too many pieces of fiction with characters like Harry Potter, but who actually have agency and don't have to go home because someone makes them, who choose to go back to a terrible and abusive environment because, oh, I must go home. You're the queen of the magical crystal castle, and you're going to go be a dirt farmer with people who don't feed you. Okay, sure, no.
I'll also add an addendum to that. So you were talking about Chicago Manual of Style, and those are style guides, which is different from Elements of Style, which is not a style guide. It's a book of advice, basically. I'm trying not to get too much and make Sparf. Yeah.
I already took that out once. I stopped.
Yeah. So style guides are kind of an awkward bit where, like, there are some nitpicky things of, like, for example, if you want to say there are so many A's in this sentence, how do you write A's, right? That's not a common thing. So, for example, my personal style is you would do A''S. I don't know if that's like Chicago Manual of Style or AP Style Guide or whatever, but there is a style guide that will tell you on all of these little nitpicky things, what is it you actually do? And for the most part, I would say it's helpful to have a style guide. It is not necessarily so important to have a particular one, right? The biggest thing that, for example, I as a publisher would care about is that you're consistent, right? So I mentioned, before, like the British and the Canadians, they put the commas in the wrong place, but they're consistent about it. So we know to go through and look for that particular thing and move them all back. So style guides, good, yes. You don't have to go crazy with them. And Elements of Style is not a style guide.
Somewhere on the internet, there's a picture that's just a copy of the Elements of Style and my middle finger.
I've seen that one.
It was a great article, and the only reason I hate it is there's an article in the Atlantic explaining, at its 50th anniversary, why it's terrible. It goes through like all the examples. Anyway, we're not going to linger on the Elements of Style anymore. That's just a bugaboo with me. So we can move on to something substantial.
Although that does remind me of something. If you are looking for good books on writing, I generally recommend the Writer's Digest series. They have a lot of good authors, and they write some pretty darn fine books in there.
Yeah. I have the Ray Bradbury's Zen and the Art of Writing, Zen and the Art of Fiction Writing, something like that. That's a really good one. Stephen King's On Writing
That's a good one.
will teach you a lot of just,
How to use your toolbox.
how to use your toolbox, yeah. And everything we talk about in terms of actual story crafting is a tool in your toolbox. Adverbs are a tool in your toolbox.
Yep.
But
How to use them.
yeah, it's like having a rip hammer, and you got 3 hammers, and you're just like, well, I need a hammer, so you grab that one, and you're just using it to drive all the nails in, and they all go in kind of crooked because it's the wrong hammer for the job most of the time.
Ursula Le Guin's Steering the Craft, also another good book for that. Look, we're doing book recommendations. That's not necessarily bad. Maybe take another question.
Tenses. How do you sort them out and keep them straight, or what is a good way to tool something?
Practice and pay attention. Unfortunately, that's, for me, kind of what I would cite it as. Know what tense you're writing in, know why it's best for your story, whether it's just because you want it or not. If you prefer past tense, write in past tense. Make sure everything you're doing is in past tense and beta read the crap out of it. Not only yourself, get it to others who can do the same, because you're going to be too close to it. Same thing with present tense, or if you're doing a tense you're not used to doing. For some reason, for example, I've gone from first to third, and that's very weird for me.
Not tense, that's person.
That is person, but still same kind of rough
Same
idea.
kind of idea, yeah.
You want to pay attention to what you're doing, be very, very careful about how you're doing it.
And if you're looking at tenses, know what you're going to do to begin with. And if you slip, it should stand out on the page if you put the story away for a bit and then you come back to it. Something's going to trip you up in a sentence. I mean, you really, it's one of those things you just sort of have to know, and then people will catch it in feedback as well. To help with that, there are really two tenses you can write in, really. There's past and there's present. If you're writing a story in future tense, I have an ice cream scoop. Most fiction is in the past tense. Some famous author once is quoted as saying, "Fiction is always in the past tense, always." And I presume it was an old white dude who said it. And I saw a couple of books on the shelf once that were present tense, and I put them down because I'm like, I can't read that. And eventually someone wrote something in the present tense that I read, and I was like, okay, no, I see why this is said. So there are books out there that are written, published by major publishers in present tense. So if you want to write that, sit down and read some of it, see how it flows. The more used to it you are, the easier it'll be to pick out problems with it.
I mean, I'd even say Out of Position as a series is all in present tense.
Yes, it is. That's, I think, the thing I read that went, oh, this can be done.
Yeah.
One last thing real quick to help you at least with that, listen to the story. If you can have it read back to you, even if it's a text-to-speech crappy app on the line, I use one all the time, and I'll catch things because it will read what you put in. It may bugger up the names, but it'll still give you the words that are on the page.
So this is actually a good piece of advice to just talk about in general at this stage, where the thing you have to realize when you are writing is you do not have access to all of the things that we can do with our voices. In particular, you completely lose out on intonation. You lose out on stress for the most part unless you are one of those writers who likes to use italics about 5 times a sentence. Please don't be that kind of writer. So in particular, what that means is that you can't expect a reader to immediately come out of a sentence and know the exact way you intended for it to be spoken. There's lots of weird ways you can misread a sentence. So like part of my job as an editor, when I'm editing something, is to just go through and say, okay, how might someone approach this sentence a way other than expected? And can that be fixed? So in addition to that, the thing that I like to do is read stories aloud, right? When you are going through the revising process, do we have a panel on editing and revising this year?
I don't actually know what the schedule is. I haven't really looked at it.
Okay, so I will say this now, regardless. When you're revising your own story, one of the most powerful things you can do is read it aloud. Because if you trip up over the words you yourself put on a page, imagine how someone who doesn't know how they're supposed to be read is going to trip up over them. That's a great way to find spots where the writing needs to be polished up.
You had it.
Oh, I was going to say that I write in present tense, and it does get people, but it is, again, it's the consistency.
Yes.
The reason why I do is because sometimes I have the people say stuff in past tense, and then when they're actually referring to it, you actually know they're referring to something that happened in the past. And that's how I always do it. I always feel like you're reading the moment of what's happening.
Right. And that's a weird thing because people will speak in both present and past tense a lot versus the narration of the story, which should consistently be in one tense until you start referring to events that happen outside the time frame that you were currently referring to. So like if you are in the narration referring to something that happened the previous day, even if you are writing a present tense story, talking about that part might go into past tense. You just have to be consistent with it.
So I went through and made notes about various things we can cover in terms of just general craft. I don't know how much of that you want to touch on. I've got thoughts on dialogue.
On dialogue. Sure, let's talk about some more of that. We can hold off on questions for the moment.
Action tags or dialogue tags?
So, okay, there are 2 conflicting pieces of advice that beginning writers get. So what happens to a lot of writers when they, usually first or second story is they go, oh, there's these things called dialogue tags. It's like the he said, she said, or any, yeah. I was going to say anagram, but that's not right. Any synonym. I don't know why I thought anagram. Any synonym for said, right? Shouted, yelled, spoke, right? You can go on and on and on. And so a lot of writers will start doing a lot of dialogue tags. Every single thing will have a dialogue tag, right? And then they might jump to the next stage, which is, oh no, I can't say the word said every other, paragraph. This is bad writing. It's not. And so they'll start running off to the thesaurus. And suddenly you have, he said, he shouted, he yelled, he ejaculated, he blah, 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 blah. It goes on and on and on like this. I have encountered stories where there is not a single word equivalent of said used twice, despite the fact that the story is thousands of words long and nothing but dialogue. This is a bit much. And then, having heard that, the writer tends to go flying off the other direction, where suddenly there are no dialogue tags whatsoever. And so we don't actually know who is necessarily supposed to be speaking at a given point in time, right? Or maybe they'll use action in place of a dialogue tag. So it's like a line of dialogue, then the person does some action, so you know that because the focus is on them, they're the one speaking, and then maybe some more dialogue or something like that. So okay, there's a couple things that come into this. First, he said, she said are perfectly fine things to use quite a lot of. They are almost invisible words, right? Just like things like the or right? You basically pay no attention to them when you're reading. So it's perfectly fine to say he said and she said a lot. But if you do it every single paragraph, then it becomes noticeable again and you need to tamp down. So using synonyms for he said, she said is fine. Don't overdo it. Also don't underdo it.
When you're writing dialogue, something that a lot of people have to learn the hard way is there is a good way to sort of research how people talk and sort of absorb that into your writing, and there's a bad way, and the good way is to sit and listen to people talking make some discrete notes, but don't like lean over and like, could you repeat what you just said? Like at the Starbucks where we all write because we want to be seen writing, so we're validated as human beings. And the bad way is don't get the way people talk from scripted television and film. Not necessarily even from other literature, although it tends to be a little closer. Tends to be. You want to avoid that because that's already been distilled through one layer of perception and cleaned up and trimmed down. And your natural tendency when writing dialogue is going to be to clean it up and make it snappier. So if it's already been trimmed once, now you're sanding down through the paint into the bare metal, and it reads really awkwardly. We don't need, I mean, you're hearing me do it like, we don't need that.
Really awkwardly. This is two adverbs. What are you doing?
They are a tool in my toolbox.
It's dialogue. I will not actually do anything with that.
Aha, I know.
There's a difference.
It's cartoon violence, folks. I'm not really an evil person. The little filler noises, obviously you want to trim that out. Like, you don't really want that in there. You cover that with an attribution tag, like, oh, blah, 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 he stammered, or whatever, and you'll get the idea. That's one of those times when you would use something other than said, when it's really, you need to draw focus to something. As a side note, that's the other thing is when you're listening to people and you want to write people who are writing accents, there are two schools of thought on this. I fall into a fence-sitting category because some people do it very well. Some people write phonetic speech very well. That's where you sort of phonetically write out with a lot of apostrophes and elisions in dialect. And then some people don't. And a lot of people in the fandom are big fans of Brian Jakes and Redwall, and the moles. Is it?
Oyamber mole speech.
Yes, that.
No, sorry.
No, it's still there. It's also you're safe.
You're safe.
It gets a bit much if there's a lot of it. If it's a side character, you can maybe get away with it. But really, the trouble with it more is that it will not age well. It won't. You can think you're being incredibly accurate to a particular dialect, and you could be, but depending on who you're depicting, that is also stands a good chance of coming across as really, really racist. You don't want that. You would then, what you want to do is look at the grammatical structures and the syntax of what is being said. A native Russian speaker speaking English is going to form their sentences a very different way than a native French speaker will form English sentences, because unless they are super fluent. But the average person, that will give you a clue. That makes a character have a unique voice without resorting to unintelligible gibberish of dialogue. And then when you have that, you can also just go the other route, which is blah, 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 he said in a very thick Eastern European accent. From that point on, occasionally you can make reference to it, like later on again, if he turns up again, it'll not break the flow of the story, because you may not know what a Sokovian accent sounds like. Marvel certainly doesn't.
No, I think you said.
Yeah.
Okay. Yay.
I did have a question in terms of dialogue. How would you treat dialogue with multiple characters, not giving one person too much screen time, as opposed to having people kind of fade into the background because there's too much dialogue between characters, and how you can kind of keep everybody relevant without seeming like you're trying to just cycle through and make sure everybody has equal screen time? It comes across as very awkward.
Personally, I have difficulty when I start getting more than 3 people in a room, and that's a me thing. That's my own difficulty itself. But it's one of those situations where, I mean, think of an actual dialogue and who's talking. Like, these two know a lot more about the actual structure and the editing aspects of writing. I know how to put words on page sometimes. Sometimes I still need them to help me with it. So it's one of those things where who know your characters, know their backgrounds. How much do they know about the subject? How much do they care about the subject? How passionate are they? Aren't they? All those other things are going to impact how much they want to speak. That's another thing I might recommend is read or listen to it aloud. Read it aloud. If you have friends who act it out for you, if you really need that layer of different voices, that might help you as well.
Yeah, and like the number of places you could look in real life and see people, like a group of 3 or more talking in a perfect cycle, is near negligible. Like the first thing that would occur to me is like maybe in a courtroom, but then of course, objection, right? So even that gets broken up. So I think you shouldn't put an emphasis on having everyone speak equally, because that's not realistic. What's helpful to remember is that in a dialogue, I don't want to say this properly.
With words.
Sparv? A dialogue is still a place where conflict happens. It's a place where people are vying for things to happen. So if you have multiple people in a room, what's their agenda? What are they trying to get? What are they trying to influence? So maybe you have 2 figures who are the primary ones who are talking because they're the ones who have the biggest amount at stake, but maybe one of them mentions something that another character really cares about. So suddenly they now interject, and now they're a part of the conversation. But when that leaves, maybe now they step out, right?
I was gonna give it, and I did just say, don't get your stuff from scripted film and television and literature and stuff. But in terms of what you're talking about, I can give you an exact place on film you can watch and see exactly how this goes. the Council of Elrond in the Fellowship of the Ring. There are a slew of principal characters. You have Elrond talks, then there's arguing, and the people who are arguing over the ring. There are more people there, and they are like, they're focused on it, they're intense, but like, they will fade into the background. So there's still a lot of characters that are important. There is a flow to that conversation, and that conversation is pure conflict. It is, the dialogue, it literally almost erupts into a fight, and does until someone speaks up. I've read fantasy novels where the tavern, like they've come, I'll say the player characters, but that's what happens when you read Dragonlance. You're sitting in the tavern and they've narrowly escaped something, but like they had a major revelation. So like the person most affected by it is not taking part of the conversation. He's using the whetstone on his sword. He's in the background. The dialogue is happening in a little bit, and then you break that up with there was a moment's silence except for so and so's repeated sharpening of his blade in the corner and a focused rhythm, and the little action breaks will help with that.
I also think it's helpful, especially as an intermediate writer, to learn how to let other things be happening while a dialogue is happening. Because if all you have is two characters speaking, yes, that can be very powerful if it's a very powerful moment, but it's also very easy for it to just be like, now this person is talking, now this person is talking, now this person is talking, now this person is talking. So if there is some standard action, particularly if it's a sequential series of actions that needs to happen, like you were mentioning, being in a tavern. What do you have to do when you go into a tavern? You have to sit down, you have to order, you have to wait, you have to get things delivered. You have to then proceed to drink or eat, whatever it is you ordered, right? This is now a sequential series of actions that you can allow to populate the dialogue, and it helps break it up. There's no immediate questions.
Talk about
No, I
characters.
think you did a pretty good job.
Oh, we have a question there.
Okay, I had a question about how quotes in Europe differ from quotes in America. In America, they're like this, whereas in Europe, sometimes you see them like this, and then in some languages, they use the double arrows like this.
German does that.
Yeah.
Technically speaking, an allowable form of marking off dialogue in English is to start a paragraph with an em dash and then proceed without any quotes whatsoever. That is an acceptable form of American English. There's plenty of different styles and types of marking dialogue, but the important thing that you should generally care about is who is going to read your story, or if you're submitting it, who is publishing, right? If you submit to an American publisher, use double quotes, standard American double quotes, because that's what we're going to format it to anyways. If you're submitting to, British publisher, or, voice, maybe you could use whatever is a standard in that particular culture. But I wouldn't, in general, mix and match unless you have an absolutely fantastically amazing reason to do so. Also, if you're asking just generally, why does that happen? I don't know. Yeah. Language is weird. English more so
It
than
comes from
others.
how typesetting technology moved across Europe. And what was easier and more pleasing to the people who started working on the printing presses once movable type became a thing.
It
And
almost sounds like you have something to do with the panel on typesetting and tools you use.
yes. This is not a writing tool.
By the way, if you want a great example of that, there's an image that went around the internet a while ago of why do certain cultures call it tea versus why do some cultures call it chai? And the answer is precisely, where did they get their tea from? If they got it from the sea route, they got it from the parts just off the coast of India where they called it tea. If they got it overland through upper and northern parts of India, they would call it chai because that's what it was called in that area.
Funny thing, Yep, my internship at where I'm from, I have to go through all these old German books and these old fonts where you look at the fonts and you're like, that's not a K, that's not an S. But what is more fascinating is when you get a German to English dictionary where the English font is the clear, legible font that I can read now, that we probably still use now, and then the word in German is that old font where you cannot read it. And it's like, I'm so glad they changed it.
This.
That's an S.
You know that's an S. Take a first-year acting student and hand them a copy of the first folio.
Oh,
and
no.
yeah,
Do you know the K?
I don't know it offhand to draw it. I would recognize it,
Oh yeah, that K's
but the so typesetting
like-
is its whole yes.
Okay, for all of you who are trying to do old-timey British things, ye old, the Y is a thorn. It is read TH. That is just the old.
There's one person I follow on Twitter who does not use TH. They use the Unicode for thorn to save characters. It's really distracting.
I mildly approve of this.
It gets tedious on this page, I'll tell you.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So I just wrote things in a list so we can just cover whatever you want.
Sure.
The next thing I have is just character development, character arc, character.
We might have a question.
Do?
Do we have a question?
I do. It's a little off topic, but when writing a story on subject matter that I'm not fully associated with, yeah. So, for instance, writing a story in a hospital setting or something like that, where I'm not privy to the more intricate details, I worry that that's going to affect the story, and that someone who does have those qualifications is going to read into that and say, "Oh no, this is wrong. This is such and such," and I struggle to get through stories because I worry about that. Is that something that I should be much more, should I research more about? How should I go about that?
I have a perfect response to this one.
I think we all do.
I have a PhD in mathematics. So I have an extreme level of knowledge of how math works. I have read stories where they mess the math up. I have read stories where they got the math completely right. What is going to be the determining factor? Usually it's the level of knowledge required to know whether or not you got that wrong. So in particular, if it is something that I can go on Wikipedia and find that you got incorrect, that's bad. If it's something that you would only have known if you read my dissertation, it's probably going to slide. So I would generally say that doing research is good. You should do research. But you will always get something wrong. Always. There is no way to be completely accurate. I have seen people who are experts mess some things up.
I mean, one example I could easily pull, is in Heat 15, my main character is a cellist. I have not played a cello in 5-ish years, and I remember enough to to Google the parts of a cello and all that other fun stuff and break it down. But at one point I had a scene where I was using musical terms, and I was arguing with the editor about how the terms that were being used, is this the correct term or not? And I wasn't 100% sure. I was fairly positive I was, but the best way I knew to answer that question is to turn to a musician. I knew a professional violinist and was able to turn to them and be like, hey, how does this work? Am I using this correctly? What other words can I use that might change it, that might make it better for the editor to look at and make him more comfortable? And we were able to go through, and they gave me actually way more information than I needed for other parts, which was great, and I ended up peppering them in later on. But it was a great way. That at that point, when you start getting to that, hey, is this accurate? That's when you might want to reach out to that point of contact if you know somebody, especially if you can find those people. Something I could recommend is on the Guild forums. There is an area for what are you an expert in? What do you have knowledge in? It's kind of like a, hey, I have a theater question and don't really know how to do theater and what the stage is like. Hey, Sparf, I know a point of contact for that.
So I'm sitting over here doing this because my philosophy on that, I've softened my stance a little bit. My philosophy used to be, it's similar to yours. It just is, if it's pretty easy to get right, then you should get it right. And if it requires access to academic journals, then you're probably on safe ground. There's always going to be somebody who's like, no. I watched doctors watching House, and like just going through an episode of House and going, you're up on charges. Like you're up before the disciplinary board 5 minutes in. What is no? And things like that. Like there's always going to be stuff wrong, but what is wrong serves the story. The thing I will tell you, and this is like furry writers will come to me because I have some degree of knowledge in the subject, and because like for about 6 or 7 straight beta reads, I was beta reading someone who was writing, a couple people who were writing action stories that were sort of heist things or whatever, so there were guns involved. And I'll give you an example of how this conversation went, because I was writing a space military sci-fi at one point, and I since dropped it. It was just a long time ago. I was like, I need to read how the mainstream, sort of pulpy mainstream authors did it. So I went out and I bought a copy of Halo: The Fall of Reach, and I get about quarter of the way into the book, and they're in the middle of a battle, and these battle-hardened soldiers in the dialogue go, "Hey, toss me a clip." I was unable to put that book down. I had to throw it with great force. Because that's a thing I know, and that is a thing that is really easy to get right, and most people get wrong because they get that stuff from the movies, which also get it wrong. Like a clip is a collection of cartridges held together by a literal clip. The metal thing that goes into a weapon, like into the pistol, that's a magazine. And people who know that will tell you. They will find you on the internet and they will tell you. But like, if that's a fairly simple thing to get right, because you can find any number of articles written by people. It's like, yeah, if you're writing firearms, and let's say you're writing about black powder. Well, if you accidentally call one thing a matchlock and then later call it a flintlock, that's not the same thing. A matchlock has a burning rope and they never fired right. And a flintlock has a piece of flint and a piece of metal that strikes a little pan full of powder and they never fired right. And I know, I fired them on stage for an entire summer. You'll always find people who know things, and with the power of the internet and reaching out, and he's right. Hit the Furry Writers Guild forums. There are people who know that stuff. I mean, there are people who know stuff about things I would never know to ask. Just definitely reach out, Google search, Wikipedia. Wikipedia is not a good academic source, but it's a great starting point. It's a fantastic starting point, because at the bottom of those Wikipedia articles is a bibliography of cited sources that are legitimate sources you can go to.
And in fact, there's a great way around some of this issue, where, let's say you are writing about firearms, and you have a character who is supposed to have some kind of weapon, and you go through and you're analyzing, you've got all these different kinds of rifles, all these different kind of makes, all these different kind of models, what in the world do? You can just say he pulled out a gun.
Especially if your point of view character is not the type of person who knows what that is, other than it is clearly a gun.
Yeah. So you can trim down what you need to actually tell people, and in so doing, avoid making mistakes. In fact, there's a story, I don't remember, this was, I think, at Asimov's or Analog, or one of the science fiction magazines, that some story got shared around where someone had a great story right up until the very end, where they were somehow, they said that when water froze, it shrank. And this was critical to the conclusion of this story at a science fiction magazine.
and a hard science fiction magazine. Not a soft science fiction. Like, Star Trek is technically right sometimes, but it's really softer sci-fi. It's more about the human story. Hard sci-fi, the people reading it really love it, and they know.
Yeah.
They know.
Yeah. Yeah, so get basic facts right. Don't go crazy worrying about the super detailed stuff that you would need an academic, profession basically to know. Unless you're writing hard sci-fi yourself, in which case, go get 5 PhDs because that's what you need. And take advantage of the fact that you can elide over details.
But also don't be Dan Brown.
Don't
That's
be
the
Dan
other
Brown.
end of the spectrum.
Yeah, don't be down Brown or General. Actually, there's a great story here in the furry fandom. So Tempo has written 2 historical novels.
Yeah,
2, yeah. The
There's
Six is Wild series. And he got called out on something that he got wrong. Because he had at one point had a character use a matchbook. They pulled a match out of a matchbook. And he got an email telling him that matchbooks hadn't been invented for 2 years after when his story was set.
They will find you.
No matter what you think, you will have a reader who is an expert in it.
You had a question first.
Oh, yeah, maybe moving on a little bit, but I know in just like some of the past sentences, there was mentions of like action stories and stuff. One thing I've wondered about in the past, and wrestled with a little bit, is balancing detailed action versus basically what the reader pace is. Because sometimes you have an action sequence that you maybe have it pictured in your head, very detailed, and describing all those actions takes a lot of words, but that would in theory require more time to read than the action itself takes place. So I was wondering if that's more something that you have to adapt to with your own personal style, descriptive of action, or if there's actually recommendations for how to balance that.
So I'm going to cheat and cop out because that's not quite my genre. However, there is a genre panel for action, I believe, at some point. I thought there was.
You look that up. I have some things to say.
I
Go
Please
figure.
say things.
Well, I know there was like, it might be adjacent, but I think there's one on Sunday that's like, your book is not a movie. I know there's that coming up, but I wasn't sure if there were more questions better here or there.
I mean, I'm happy to give you the short version, which is you can fudge that. Reader's perception of length is not based on the length of the page always. It's not based on the number of words. It's based on the punctuation and how short your sentences are. If you are writing a snappy action scene, keep those sentences short. And you want to vary sentence length, but especially if you are like me and I write really long, convoluted sentences that would make Lovecraft blush. And screw that guy. But racist pig. Anyway, he wrote really long sentences. I write really long sentences, but if you're in the middle of something like that where you tend to be longer, it's going to stand out when things start to pick up. If it's like, he grabbed the gun, he took a breath and rounded the corner, pistol raised. Like, very short bursts. Don't use a whole lot of long words unless they're necessary. Like, shorten up your word choice, and it will flow more quickly. Even if that action scene takes 2 pages, it's going to fly by because the reader has time. It has less time because they're going next thing. Now the thing you have to worry about pacing that is if it does still get long, you have to take a paragraph every now and then and lengthen things out so that the reader can breathe and catch up. Otherwise, they're going to read through it and they'll be like, I don't know what just happened.
So 2 things. One, to bounce off that, another way, especially when it comes to dialogue, using action tags does keep everything moving. That can help your pacing. And speaking of pacing, one of the reasons I would feel that, again, spinning and not my lane, action is nothing but tension. And while there isn't necessarily an action genre panel, there is one about atmosphere and tension in narrative structure. So that may be something that might be helpful on Saturday, 9 p.m.
I'm not certain I have too many things to add because I'm not especially good at action. But I will kind of spin off that on the idea of the more detail you put onto a single action, the slower it will seem to go.
Right.
So if you are describing, say, a martial arts battle of some kind, right? He punched, he jabbed, he blocked, right? Quick actions, and you're describing each one very quickly. But if you take a long time to describe, the force of the blow, the way it connected under the ribs, and so on and so forth, the more time you take on that one single action, the more time it will feel like it's taking for the reader. So that will slow things down as well.
Because I like my high fantasy genres, so, sword fights and magic fights. Describing the swing is something that I like to do, and I know that takes time. So.
Also be aware of over repeating yourself. Like if you are describing the same style of sword strike over and over again, the reader is going to start tuning it out.
So I think we're only an hour, right? So we got what?
No, we got an hour and a half.
Oh, we got an hour and a half? Oh, great.
We're all the way to 2:30.
Oh, buddy, I'm happier now. I thought I had talked us into a corner.
Going back to your talk there about dialogue and then also getting your facts right and things like that. What's your take on using jargon and lingo in your story? Like, for example, if you're in a military setting, everyone knows military has a language pretty much all of their own. How much of that should you or should you not incorporate into your story?
My simple answer is it all depends on who your audience is. If you're writing for a military audience who's going to know this jargon, use the jargon that they expect to see. If you're not writing for that, if you're writing for a general audience, say you're trying to write something for heat, you happen to have some military jargon in there, keep it in the dialogue, but make sure your narrator explains it for the audience so they know what's going on too.
Right. A lot of simple jargon you can pick up from context. So if you've got like a few key words, I'm trying to think of like military jargon off the top of my head.
Snafu, fuba,
snafu,
CO.
but that's fairly commonly known as well. Like DFAC, right? DFAC is military jargon.
EXO is one that I could think
Or
of.
if someone says direct, as in, I got it. Like that's a I don't know how military that is, but I know specifically that is emergency services. But one of my staff at Furthermore is a 911 dispatcher, so like I will tell her something that needs to be done, she'll say direct. I'm like, right, that's what that means. So like it takes me a second, so the more jargon you have that the reader has, they're gonna stumble over it, but that's not necessarily, like, I am a little bit of the opinion, and I'm actually, this is kind of a minority opinion. I'm of the opinion that dictionaries exist for a reason, and if you don't know that word, skip it. That's how I read stuff. If I don't know a word and I don't want to be bothered to go look it up, skip it. And if I end up skipping like most of it, I'll give you a prime example of, it's not jargon, but it's uncommonly used words used in uncommon ways. Palimpsest by Cat Valenti. The dream sequences are written with words that a gifted and talented student in high school who had the most wonderful vocabulary used solely for pleasing teachers and getting all manner of validation, was looking at them and going, I know the linguistic root of that word. I know how it's flowing in the sentence. I know nothing of the definition, and I'm not looking it up because this whole paragraph is that, and it forms a beautiful picture. I'm okay with that. Most writers will tell you, and it's probably honestly better advice than I'm giving you, is you should probably write to the level you expect your readership to be. If you're writing military sci-fi for a military sci-fi reading audience, go nuts. Go nuts. If you're writing military sci-fi for heat, I would advise sanding those edges down and just, we're here for a different part of the story in this multiple different parts of the story usually. This isn't an AD panel.
I'd also go with this just for the sense of using jargon and lingo to give a feeling of, I'm going to mispronounce this word, milieu?
Milieu? Yeah.
Is something you have to be very, very careful with. And a great bit of analysis I saw on this, I think it's from Extra Credits, the YouTube series on video games, where they go through the opening sequence of Skyrim. Because they point out that the opening sequence of Skyrim sucks. It is nothing but jargon and lingo. At one point, one of his characters just starts praying to the 9 divines and just lists them all. And then we go on to something else. How are you going to remember any of that? You're not going to remember the names of each of the 9 divines because you just got introduced to the story.
Unless you read all the books in all the other ones and had spent 1,000 hours doing that.
Right. So it's not setting
Spent
up
1,000 hours
actual
on the Lestia Argonian.
milieu. It's setting up you are expected to already know this or else. Right? So trying to find that good balance is a useful thing.
I'll give you an example that is military sci-fi related, but it is video game related. Metal Gear Solid, the first Metal Gear Solid. There is a point, and there was a point in the game toward the end where you're on the codec with the colonel, and it says, "I told you, the Secretary of Defense is in operational control. He's on his way there by AWACS." I still don't know what AWACS is, and I don't know if it made sense or not. I never looked it up because I was too busy shooting a nuclear tank. Like, sometimes those things you don't know and you don't care because there's a nuclear tank.
As the military aviation historian, no, that doesn't make sense.
There are people who know things. You will find them, and they will help you.
On the topic of vocabulary, do you have a recommended approach to expanding the vocabulary?
Read.
What they said.
And in particular, read authors who use more complicated language, like Cavalenti. If you read Cavalenti, anything she wrote, I mean, if you read Deathless, or if you read Radiance, or if you read Palimpsest, like her particular syntax and the words she chooses to use and how she paints a story, you'll pick up all manner of interesting words. Now, the thing is, you can pick up all manner of interesting words, just make sure you know how to use them if you're going to use them.
Yeah.
Now, that's why feedback is important. Like your beta readers will hopefully catch that and go, you keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. Like when someone says, oh, he used it as a pejorative. That is not a word. Pejorative. It is pejorative. Pejorative implies perjury, but not really, because it's not really a word.
If it's in the English language, it can be. I'm a writer, damn it.
I was about to say you are not Shakespeare.
Right there.
You are not. I was about to say you are not Shakespeare, but that actually leads me to something I do want to talk about in terms of intermediate writing. So I want to talk about this. This is endemic to fantasy because of fantasy fandom's origins and how it became popular and who it became popular from. The primary focus you should, as a writer, have is the story. You can have all kinds of fun mapping out 4,000 years worth of lunar phases. You can write the history of every civilization in there. That's fun. I enjoy doing it. It's great. But you're not putting story words on a page. That is useless to anyone outside of your head. If you want to do that, do it. I'm not saying don't do it. But what I'm telling you is you are not Tolkien. Unless you are, you're probably not Tolkien. What my recommendation, and it has to do with the readership has changed vastly since Tolkien wrote, and even since Christopher Tolkien picked up and started doing things which are a little bit softer on the eye sometimes, is he wrote in a very particular narrative structure that is not really in vogue. The third person omniscient point of view. The third person omniscient point of view it's still valid. You can use it. It's there. If you want to do it, Don't let me tell you not to do it. You write your story. Everything I'm saying, by the way, is just advice from my point of view, and if you think I'm full of it, I'm not going to come and hunt you down and say, you're not doing it the way I told you. Tolkien spent a lot of time on his world building because of his background in classical literature, mythology, and because he had the stability of a distinguished academic chair at a prestigious university to sit on, to fall back on. He could spend his time doing that. You could spend your time doing that. What I recommend doing is write the story you want to tell, and then if you're really into the sort of legendarium kind of stuff with the compendiums and the maps and things, take what you've written out of the story once you started working on the story and put it in a OneNote file, in Scrivener, in a wiki, personal wiki, something like that. Keep all your notes like that, and then refer to them as you write further stories and add new elements into your universe, and you'll eventually have that huge world building that you want without killing yourself trying to write that before you ever really start a story. Because I know paralysis by analysis. I live this. If you go down that path, there is a very good chance, it's not 100%, but there's a very good chance you will never start writing the story. I had a friend way back about 10 years ago. I visited him in Ohio, and he was like, oh yeah, I've been writing this sci-fi novel in this universe. I said, okay. He's like, you want me to tell you about it? And I, young and foolish, I said yes. And he proceeded to tell me all about it. And then he said, well, okay, then what do you think happens? And I'm like, well, given everything you've said, this. Oh no, this happens because of all these other things I didn't tell you. And there was never any border to this world building. And I'm going, that's massive. I don't know how you're going to work with it. To my knowledge, he never has, because he's still writing the world, and that was 10 years ago. It's not universal, but it's a good cautionary tale.
I wish to follow this up before we take a question, because you brought up another great thing that Tolkien has unfortunately made people do. Okay, we have a bunch of writers in the room. How many of you are writing a novel? Okay, of you novel writers, how many of your novels has a prologue? "99% of the time, you do not need a prologue. Prologues usually serve the purpose of somehow introducing the world or introducing backstory, when that's not what we care about. We care about the story. So be very, very careful before you write a prologue. I'm not saying you can't do it, I'm just saying be very careful. I'm also saying, as someone who works for Sofel Press, that we have occasionally said things like, your prologue isn't doing anything, just get rid of it.
Now, something that I did think was funny is the aged author in my writers group, who also says the same thing: get rid of a prologue. You're writing a prologue. Get this out of here. Give me the information I need. Was told by her publisher to add a prologue to a series. Now, that is a publisher's decision. The writer was like, "Ew, are you kidding?" But she did it because the publisher said so. So, one of those, yes, they're currently out of vogue. Don't do them if you could avoid them. But.
And there are good prologues out there. But 99% of the writers, especially 99% of the writers who are writing at an intermediate level, don't need them.
On the topic of world building, you hit on the approach that I am actually lean towards, is building the world as you write the stories. What would you consider if nothing else, the essential elements that you want to include in the world that you're building?
Whatever you need.
Whatever you need?
Yeah, what you need, he's right.
Like political structure or religion, geography?
So the way I would handle it is, as Sparth was saying, write your story.
Okay.
Don't ask the questions until you need to ask them. Okay. I mentioned actually talking with another panelist earlier this week about a scene in my story that I added because of feedback he gave. And the issue I was having is, okay, what logical explanation could I give these characters for having this?
Right.
What is the lie they're telling? And that required on-the-spot world building
Okay.
to try to make sense of it. I didn't think of why these other characters needed books until that point because it didn't matter. That's when it mattered to me right then and there.
Okay.
And another thing to be careful about is overworld building in a case where you can quickly write yourself in the corners.
Right.
In particular because I don't remember the exact details of this tale, but I had heard from someone that they were reading a book, and in this book there was like whatever culture was doing this was an isolated culture, and they didn't mine. They didn't mine for anything.
Right.
And yet somehow they were paying and exchanging goods with copious amounts of gold and gems with no mining. They had written one aspect of the culture just going, hey, this is a cool fact, not realizing that it had all of these consequences which they weren't paying any attention to.
Right.
So you have to be very careful about overworld building in some cases.
And you brought up political structures, religion, like that comes into a story when a character is put up against those forces. So are they breaking the law? Then the governmental structure might come into place. Are they committing what the Catholics will call a mortal sin? Well, now you start to dig into a little bit of the religion, but you don't have to flesh the full thing out at a time. Like, what is relevant? Like the guy just ate a prey species after he killed him. Like, that's a horrible taboo. Who's it a taboo to? What is the punishment? What happens? Is he shunned? Is he killed? What is that?
Right.
And then from there, you can follow the logic back as you need it, but you really, the more you leave a mystery, the happy you will be if you're writing a series, because then you can make shit up later. You can bring in something interesting. It's like if you're writing an analog of the Catholic Church, and you just have the general sort of, you've got the parish priest and the bishop and all that. Well, that's, okay, you've had interactions along those lines. Second book comes around, now you're dealing with forbidden knowledge, and all of a sudden this order turns up that you haven't mentioned previously. Well, you didn't have a reason to mention them.
Right.
They can exist. So now you've got Jesuits, or Templar, or whoever. And those come into the next book. And then the next book, you've got, they're stuck, they're going to the city, and there's a city, and they get stuck there because it's shut down because of plague. Well, now there's the priests are in this city are of an order that is an order of healers. You didn't know that before, but you know it now.
I think also just generally in world building, it's helpful to just read up on history, on how cultures interact.
Right.
If for no other reason, then you can just, again, pick out those things that someone who is aware of them would go, oh, wait a minute, what do you mean they don't have any sort of trading structure? How are they getting all these goods?
Right.
Right. Other questions or next item on the list? We still got a little bit of time, though.
Yep.
Okay.
It's about 15.
Yeah, another 15. I have character down on the list.
Characters.
Yeah.
Let's talk about characters.
Talk about characters.
Characters in a story? No.
Sometimes characters are the story, and sometimes it ticks off other writers.
Sometimes the characters and their development are the most important thing in this story. That's a character-driven story.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the plot is what moves the story, and the characters are incidental to the plot, and that's a plot-driven story. And then you have blends in between. And some people desperately hate you if you write one or the other, and that's fine. I mean, what I mostly think of is in terms of intermediate stuff is character arc.
Mm-hmm.
The writers in the fandom in particular, we all sort of influence each other, and we will often reference Star Wars because episode 4 has very clear character arcs. You could follow them. I stole years ago from Kyle Gold, which he got from a screenwriting class, the three things that every single character that you write has, and that's a want, they have a need, and they have what they term a ghost. And the want is what the character wants. Luke Skywalker wants adventure. He wants to get off Tatooine. He wants to go out into the galaxy and be a rebel and do this stuff. Luke Skywalker needs to grow up. And I don't say that as an insult, despite my tone, but that's what he needs. So the want and the need not being the same will lead to some conflict, which is in terms of character, which then adds drama to your story. The ghost is something that haunts a character. Doesn't have to be literal in terms of like a tragedy, but it can be something. Luke Skywalker again. In episode 4, before George Lucas decided to make Vader Luke's father, he was haunted by this specter of this great Jedi warrior father. Like he wanted to live up to that, and that hung over all the actions he takes throughout the movie. And when we talk about character arc, the character Luke starts here. He starts off immature and needing to grow up, and he needs to grow up, and he wants adventure. By the end of the movie, there's the scene in the hangar where Han has gotten his reward, and he stops by and is like, "Hey, this is a suicide mission. Like, why don't you just come with us? We could use a kid like you in our smuggling scoundrel operation." And Luke's character has changed through the experiences in the movie to the point where he no longer wants what he wanted. He has achieved his need. He's grown up. He's matured. And he doesn't want that adventure anymore. He realizes now there's something more important. So that arc is crystal clear. And that's why it's such a good, and that's what I was referencing earlier with Joseph Campbell, like it's beat for beat his hero's journey.
Actually, you can take the hero's journey, and you can break that down into so many different things. And one that actually I saw it on Facebook that was comparing Naruto and Star Wars, specifically the character of Naruto Uzumaki and Luke Skywalker, because the hero's journey, granted, one is spread over 600 plus episodes and 2 series, but you can still see the connections of everything there because the hero's journey is everywhere.
If I were to talk on character to this audience, I would not be talking directly on character arc at the moment. I want to talk about the difference between 3-dimensional and 1-dimensional characters. So people a lot of times hear that, like the characters are too flat, the characters are too 1-dimensional. What does this generally mean? It means there's not nuance to them. They have one purpose, they do the one thing, that's all they're good for. And sometimes you'll see, especially in very plot-focused stories, the characters are extraordinarily one-dimensional because they aren't the focus. The focus is on the story. So
Ocean's 11.
Yeah, right?
Heist stories are great examples of this.
Because particularly in that movie, what's the focus on? The focus is on how you do it. And particularly with the reversal at the end, how did they really do it, right? If you look at some of the characters, heck, even if you look at Danny Ocean, there's not a lot of nuance to it, right? He has basically one goal, he tries to achieve that, and that's it. Now, especially pointing out Ocean's 11, is that having one-dimensional characters is not a bad thing. This is a lesson that a lot of writers mislearn at some point, where, oh no, I have a one-dimensional character. They need to be made 3-dimensional. I need to give all of my characters nuance. No, it depends on the role they're serving. Is the focus on the character on how they act? If so, then they better be more nuanced. Or they could just be what is known as a spear carrier. A spear carrier is a character who exists in a story for one role and one role only.
Bring the spear on stage.
They bring the spear on stage. I kind of want to flip back in my mind to the Pirates of the Caribbean, Curse of the Black Pearl, right? You had a number of side characters in there whose sole purpose was to be funny, right? You had the two
depths, whatever mutton it for a parlay.
Exactly, like the pirate who's missing the eyeball, right? Why is he missing an eyeball? So he can have fun adventures chasing it, right? Does he have any other aspect to his character? Not really. And they had their equivalent versions in the Navy, right?
Yeah, the two redcoats who argue with Jack Sparrow right before he steals the ship because they're too dumb and don't catch him.
Right? What's their point? It's to be funny. And that's perfectly fine. It's perfectly fine to have spear carriers. You generally don't want your main character to be a spear carrier.
Unless they're iconic characters. So, for example, Conan the Barbarian doesn't actually develop as a character if you take the show as a whole. So, or bring it more modern, Conan the Salaryman? That Twitter page is kind of hilarious because it's still this iconic character just in a modern setting. And
At last Monday is over by Crom. He kicked open the door, slung his broadsword over his shoulder, and stormed out.
And that is where that one-dimensional character is the fact that is what makes him so iconic. He is that one dimension, and it's important that is part of the story. It's how is this one-dimensional character going to be this badass in this scene? What are they going to do that is going to be the awesome thing that because they're just so awesome?
Drizzt from Forgotten Realms, Elric, also. Like, there's a lot of this in, like, D&D tie-in fiction. The characters just, like, they will appear multiple times and they really don't change, which is, but they are nuanced, but they don't really change. They have one aspect to them that you focus on. He is a powerful barbarian. That is who you know.
You're just making me think of another example because of you, which is Magic the Gathering. Magic the Gathering tends to have story arcs where they focus on a few set characters who have very clearly defined, very simple roles, right? Mm-hmm. What does Liliana Vest do? Well, she's kind of a necromancer. Ta-da! You now know her character.
Whichever Elder Dragon became a planeswalker, what does he do? He betrays people.
Nicol
Bolas, what does he do? He betrays people.
Yep.
That's what he does. What does Tevesh Zot do? Betrays people and gets fried for it. That's what he does.
You have a question?
So you're saying that in a very plot-driven story, the characters might lack nuance, and that's okay. What would be the inverse of that? What is the cost of plot? Is there a cost of plot?
Sure. The immediate thing I would leap to, because it was a very popular story for a while, is God of Small Things. Right? God of Small Things, how much actually happens in that story?
So does the plot then also weirdly become more nuanced in that the events that happen are smaller? Or is it?
It can.
So,
big, powerful?
if I could plug myself a little bit, partially because this is one thing that stuck out to me, thinking I did a beta trade with the story for Arcana that ended up getting accepted. And the first time I had this story, I had one person blatantly tell me, there is no conflict here. I had another person tell me, oh my God, I love this story. And a third person tell me neither of these things. So I'm like, you're just like, I can do this, I can do this. I'm like, you aren't helping me. I still submitted the story. It was so character driven. It was all internal conflict. It's how am I dealing with my alcoholic mother? And my mother is never going to read that story for reasons. And it's just, it was such an internal story. Nothing happens on the outside. It's just this main character dealing with his mother's alcoholism. And oh, I had to bring the wine. And this stresses me out, something fierce, because of it. And it's just nothing but internal conflict.
So essentially make the story interact more with the nuance of the characters.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's always important. Things need to happen. It's not a story unless something happens. But what happens can be small things, right? You can have a character-focused story where the major climax of the story is the character changing their mind, because that was something that happened. But you shouldn't have a character-focused story where it's just, oh, let me tell you about this character. Okay, now we're done talking about the character, story over. That's the thing to avoid.
Yeah, and like a character-driven story like that is going to be like actually made a whole paragraph about conflict about this in particular, because one of the popular authors in the fandom is Kyle Gold. His flagship series is the Devonley books is Out of Position. There has to be conflict that in it something happens, so there has to be conflict. This conflict drives things happening. The conflict in a story and this is fairly true. It can't be something that can be resolved by a simple act with no consequences. And this is where I get into arguments about out of position, because some people say, well, if they would just, all they have to do is apologize. Yeah, but their character flaws do not permit them to do so. Lee is woefully immature, and Dev is emotionally stunted, and they grow as characters, and that conflict resolves itself through character growth, not solely through action and what they do. And so those internal conflicts have to be there, and there have to be consequences so that those characters make the decisions they make. There's a reason why I won't do this thing, even though this would solve my problem. Off the top of my head, I am being hunted down by loan sharks. And I'm a character who is extremely religious, I don't know how I got in with loan sharks, take it as read. I could then turn to something for money that is repugnant to me as a person, to my religion, to everything. It would give me the money I require to pay off the loan sharks. It would save my life. The consequence to that character then is possibly their immortal soul. Is that an exchange they're willing to make in order to keep their life? If yes, these consequences. If no, these consequences. But there are consequences to either choice, and you might make this choice or you might not make this choice depending on whether that character is willing to accept that set of consequences or not. And that is where that has to be. Otherwise, you will fall into but nothing happened if you're not careful, because those conflicts aren't driving the plot that they should be driving.
And so you brought up Ocean's 11 before, so let me reflect back on that one to kind of draw on the point, which is that the whole purpose, the reason why Danny Ocean set up this thing was to prove to his wife, or his ex-wife, that her current boyfriend is no good, right? The plot would have been over if, when he first confronts her near the start of the movie and says, hey, this guy is no good, that she had said, oh, you're right. There wouldn't have been a movie.
Yeah.
Now, we could have just had her not believe him and the movie continue forward. And maybe this would have been unbelievable, especially given everything we've seen of that particular character, right? We know this guy is no good. Why doesn't she believe he's no good? But they do a lot of work in the movie as well to show off that, yeah, she's got good reason to not trust Danny on this one. And therefore, we have a movie.
So we are 3 minutes from time. So there's one thing I want to say in terms we've mentioned over and over, get critique other people. That's the best way to improve. The one thing I want to say about that is be firm in your critique, but be kind in your critique. There are good things to almost any story. If you think you found the story where there are no good things, you're wrong.
You capitalize the letters at the beginning of the sentences. That's a good thing.
I mean, that's going to sound, but yes.
Condescending, but...
It's going to sound, you can find something good. You know, I really liked this one part. I thought that was cool. But this character is extremely problematic. This character is, you really want to run this by some sensitivity readers, because I'm not qualified to tell you this, but I think you might not be doing this right. Or would it be kind, because it serves no one to think you're the Gordon Ramsay of literature. You aren't, and you are going to erect bridges only to set them on fire immediately. You make a connection, you make new connections with people, and then the first thing you do is you go in and you critique them like a sledgehammer, and you're going to they're going to pull back probably. They're going to look at you, and it's going to be, well, this is a person I don't think I can trust, because they're inordinately harsh, and people will say, well, I'm brutally honest. No, you're being a dick.
I will say though, I would totally recommend Do not be a dick. There are some times, though, if you are receiving that kind of critique, if you can acknowledge the words that they're saying, while they may be being harsh, truly think about the words they're saying. I cite Otter before he did RAR. He was brutal because that's what he was used to. But his words were earnest. He wasn't trying to be a dick about it. He was just like, okay, what is this? What is this? Why? And he would be tearing the story apart. And he had a point. It's one of those things, if you can be open-minded about a critique, remember they're probably, especially if you talk with the person and they don't seem like a dick, they're probably not trying to be one. You could certainly open their eyes and, hey, the way you did that was kind of not nice. We had that conversation.
Yeah. And to piggyback on this, I was sitting in here when the Otter told this in the last panel. The thing he forgot was to say, oh, but you did this well. Like, I have issues with all of this, but you did this well. You do not want to be the kind of person giving critique who starts going nuts in the comments thread the longer the story goes, and you start keyboard mashing and talking about eject buttons. Because that is not being a good critiquing partner. At that point, you literally are just kind of being a dick. And people, hopefully, if you do that, will point it out to you, and hopefully it's not intentional. But if you're doing it intentionally, stop doing it intentionally. Remember to be kind.
I think we need to go.
Yep. I think we need to go.
Thank you all for attending. This has been Writing Intermediate.